On the wild frontier, courage shapes destiny. Love can bloom where fear reigns, and hope rises even in the darkest nights beneath the endless western sky. The wind moved through the cottonwoods like a whisper that could not remember its source. Bells at the cavalry stables jingled in uneasy rhythm, and a lantern swung by the gate where a sentry fought sleep. A scream rose from the wagon yard and split the hour. People rushed with torches, but the smoke of their breath hid more than it revealed. Sarah Benson pulled on her shawl and ran, her boots crunching grit, her mind repeating the names of the two friends already missing this week. She saw soldiers search the sheds and peer into feed barrels. She heard a lieutenant mutter that the command would never admit what the town already feared. Another scream cut the night. Closer. She stepped toward the well, and a shadow uncoiled from the stones. An arm seized her wrist. The grip carried the calm of someone who did this often. In panic, she tried to twist free, then slammed the bucket yoke into the figure and felt the hold break. A soft thrum answered the struggle. The attacker lurched and collapsed as a willow shaft sprouted from his coat. Sarah staggered back, and the lantern glow revealed a young Lakota with a rawhide bow and a face set like carved earth. He moved with the quiet certainty of plains hunting, set one knee to the ground, and looked up toward the rooftops. Two more shapes melted away beyond the livery and ran for the river trail. The Lakota offered his hand. His voice was low and steady. "My name is Taka. You will not be taken." Sarah wanted to ask who he was and why he roamed the post at that hour, but the yard erupted as sergeants barked orders. The man on the ground groaned, then tried to roll. The Lakota kicked the revolver from the attacker's glove and pressed him with a boot. "There will be more," he said. "They use the well path for cover. They will return before dawn if the yard quiets." Sarah stared at the fallen man and noticed a neat brand on the clamp of his belt, a horseshoe flanked by wings. She knew that mark from the freight house. It belonged to a contractor who drank with certain officers after taps. The thought set her jaw. She raised her eyes to Taka again. "You saved me," she said, her voice thin from the cold. "Help me save the others." "I track a woman who vanished 3 weeks ago," he answered. "She is my sister. The trail reaches this post and fades into wagons that run south. I came to find the wagons, and I found you in their snare." He looked toward the river. "They store people near water. It hides prints, it carries boats." Sarah shivered at the cruelty implied. Hoofbeats clattered through the east gate, and a patrol flooded the yard with clumsy energy. Taka lifted the attacker by the collar and handed him to a corporal who tried to act in charge. "Hold him," Taka said. The corporal stared at the arrow and found his voice. "You there, step back. Who are you to command soldiers?" Sarah stepped between them. "He just saved me from a kidnapping in the heart of your post." Her tone made several troopers glance at one another. The lieutenant arrived and peered sharp enough to shave wood. "No one is taken from my yard," he said, while the man with the arrow in his coat breathed in ragged puffs. "Search every shed and wake the doctor." In the shuffle, Taka leaned close to Sarah. "There is a place by the river, an old storehouse. I heard voices there at dusk. I can guide you, but you must be quiet and quicker than orders." She nodded. Her fear did not vanish, but it bent into a purpose that steadied her steps. They slipped along the paling fences and out through a gap near the farrier's bins. The moon rose hazy, a smudge behind prairie dust. At the river, a broken molasses warehouse leaned against cottonroot roots and black water. Low light leaked from a crack in the boards. Sarah heard a woman sob, then the flat slap of a hand, silencing mercy. Her throat tightened. Taka touched her sleeve with a gentleness that surprised her and whispered that she should wait while he moved around the far side. He vanished like a heron sinking into reeds. She counted slow, then pushed the door with the heel of her hand and let it whisper open. Inside, a small lamp burned near crates and a coil of chain. 2 men argued over a ledger. One said that the captain would pay better once the town grew used to fear. The other laughed, and used the word savage in a way that forced bile into her mouth. Sarah set her jaw. When the men heard the door, they turned, but their amusement died when shadows shifted at the back wall. The lamp burst as an arrow clipped its glass and darkness fell. A shot cracked from the ledger table. She dropped behind a barrel. Taka fired from the far corner, steady and spare. The first man fell against the crates. The second fled through the side door, splashing into willow shallows. The sobbing voice rose again from a crate wrapped in sailcloth. Sarah cut the lashing with a rusted hook, and a thin girl tumbled out into her arms, gasping air that smelled of river and pitch. "There are more," the girl whispered. "They move them in wagons after taps." Sarah held her and looked across the black room to the Lakota hunter who had changed the shape of her night. He met her gaze, not as a rescuer seeking praise, but as a man making a vow that bound him to the next hour. "Then we follow the wagons," Taka said. "We follow until the river widens, and the trail tells us where the women are kept. I will find my sister. You will not face this alone." The night held its breath. 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 Morning gave the yard a worn gold that felt like dust made into light. The commander of the post allowed no public alarm, yet word moved faster than any order. Sarah and Taka avoided the headquarters building and crossed to the freight sheds where drovers drank coffee and sharpened gossip into tools. She let a coin slip onto the counter and asked about wagons that ran south after dark. One man smirked and said the town would sleep better if heathens were pushed across every border. Another warned him to hold his tongue. Taka listened without glare, his patience like winter river ice. He pointed to a set of iron wheel marks that cut across the yard toward the ford. "Fresh," he said. "Last run near dawn." They rode out on 2 horses that Sarah borrowed from her father's string, a steady dun and a quick sorrel that hated geese. The trail hugged the Smoky Hill River, then turned through a stand of cottonwood where the bark peeled like old paper. At a sandbar they found a broken barrel and a coil of hemp that smelled of salt. Taka measured footprints with his palm and named details the way a reader names letters. 4 men, steady pace. 2 halt for smoke. 1 favors a leg, 1 drags his right heel. A small boot had moved among them, toes inward, and it cut her heart to believe it belonged to a girl who had learned to walk in fear. "The path will bend toward the limestone bluffs," he said. "There are caves. Wagons hide well in caves." They reached a chalk ridge by noon. Heat shimmered like lidless eyes. From the ridge they saw a cabin at a ford, a rope ferry, and a shed with a slant roof that looked too new for honest weather. Taka pointed at the earth near the shed and said the line of the ground was wrong, padded level to erase scuffle. He wanted to wait for night, but a thin wail rode the wind and burned delay away. They moved down together, slow, then quicker, when 2 riders led a bound figure from the shed toward the ferry. Sarah raised her rifle and called out to stop. The nearer rider answered with a shot that spat dust at her feet, and then laughed because he believed his position strong. "Go back to your post," he shouted. "You want trouble, the captain will drown you in it." And Taka fired first and neat. The laughing man fell from the saddle into river grass. The second rider swung the bound figure across his saddle and spurred for the ferry. Sarah and Taka ran for cover and traded shots with 2 more men who rose from the brush. The air filled with grit and blind echoes. A bullet grazed the ferry rope and the raft slewed wide, wedging against rocks where the current hissed. Taka moved like a hawk that knew wind by touch. He reached the ferry head, jumped to the raft, and knocked the rider into the river with the flat of his rifle. Sarah covered him, counting his breath to steady her own. The bound figure slid toward the water. She threw herself low and pulled the shape back by the shoulders. A hood came off. A young woman blinked in shock and cried one name. "Anpa." "In." The name hit Taka like a bell. He turned with a focus that carved the moment clean. "My sister," he said. And for an instant Sarah saw hope and fear meet in the same face. 2 men on the far bank began to fire. Taka grabbed the ferry pole and heaved until the raft scraped free. The river tried to spin them, but he denied it with the stubborn force of a man who had already buried too much. Sarah held the rescued woman and spoke quiet words that she hoped were stronger than noise. They reached the near shore as more riders poured from the trees. The fight that followed was quick and lit by anger. Riders circled. Sarah fired, worked the lever, fired again. Taka took the bridle of a loose horse and sent it crashing into two men who thought they were hunters. Some of the band fled when they saw the tide turn. Others kept firing until their courage broke under the lower sky. When the smoke thinned, the yard lay silent except for the hiss of the cut ferry rope. They had the woman. They had several led horses. They had ledgers from the slant roof shed. Taka did not smile. He knelt beside his sister and spoke to her in Lakota, words that sounded like bark and water, and a promise made under frost. And Anpa had bruises and a fever, but she could stand with help. She said the woman behind the doctor's door at the post paid the gang and counted the money herself. She said a soldier with a silver ring provided patrol routes. She said women were moved from this ford to a cavern north of the old rail spur where limestone broke into shelves. Sarah felt a steady rage build inside, not hot like a spark, but firm like a wedge set into oak. "We go back," she said. "We go back with proof." Taka nodded. For the first time since dawn, he allowed his hand to rest on Sarah's shoulder. It was a small gesture that carried the weight of two lives that had begun to braid. The night held its breath. 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 Back at the post, life tried to look normal, while rumor crawled like wind under every sill. Sarah brought Anpa to a quiet bunk in the laundry house where women who had seen storms knew how to keep gentle watch. Taka and Sarah carried the ledgers to the commander, who read a page and then closed the book with care that felt more like fear than caution. He said he would act, but he asked them not to stir the town. His voice sought control that events had already stolen. Sarah leaned across the desk and told him names, and when she said that the doctor's wife counted coin at the shed, his eyes cooled into stone. He said he would question the lady at once. Taka did not argue, but his jaw showed the pressure of what he held back. They waited under the eaves of the infirmary while a storm built out of the west. Thunder rolled across the flats like wagons dragging chains. The doctor came to the door with clean hands and a wary look that belonged to a man who kept two lives. His wife arrived in a dress that did not fit the weather. She glanced at the ledgers and laughed as if bookkeeping were simple housekeeping. The commander asked formal questions. She answered with smooth pauses and said the notes were from church charity. A private burst in, breathless, and whispered to the commander that 2 guards had been found gagged by the river road. The wife's smile tilted like a plate that had lost its table, and Taka stepped forward. "Where is the silver ring?" he asked gently. "The one the soldier wears when he carries news." She turned her head too slowly. The commander asked again with rank in the syllables. The woman said she had never seen such a ring. At that instant a shout rose from the parade ground. 4 riders crashed the gate and fired toward the infirmary windows. Glass fell in a rain that did not cut skin but cut calm. Sarah pulled the wife down by instinct, then saw the cold calculation in the woman's eyes as she used the shelter to crawl toward the back stairs. "She is running," Sarah yelled, and pushed after her while Taka and the troopers returned fire. The chase ran through the hospital corridor where the floor smelled of spirits and mint. The wife fled into a storage hall and reached for a crate. Sarah saw the glint of a hidden revolver, kicked the lid shut, and pinned the woman to the wall with both forearms. "Stop," she said, her voice barely more than breath. "This ends now." The woman spat words that carried no courage of their own, and called her a fool who would ruin fine plans. Men outside shouted for positions. Taka entered at a run a moment later. He did not raise a hand. He simply held the gaze of the woman until her fight went thin. Troopers took her into custody. The silver ring was on a ribbon in her sleeve. An evening settled over the post with a heavy quiet. The commander, who had begun the day in doubt, ordered a sweep of the rail spur and the limestone shelves. He asked Taka to guide a squad. He asked Sarah to remain, for her safety and for the sake of witnesses. She refused. "I started this night in fear," she said. "I will not end it with my hands folded." He studied her and gave a slow nod that admitted the obvious. They rode out together with stormlight on the horizon and prairie larks lifting in the wind, as if the world still held songs that were worth the air. Along the spur they found burned torches and scuffed stone. A narrow stair of natural shelves led down to a dark seam that breathed cool air. From below came the murmur of people and the clink of metal. Taka laid out the plan in few words. 2 troopers would take the shelf above the entrance. Sarah and he would move inside with the first rush and break the chain that held the pens. The squad would hold the mouth of the cave and keep the riders from gathering. It sounded simple because it had to be. The rush was a burst of light and grit. Sarah and Taka went in shoulder to shoulder. A gun barked near the gate and a spark jumped from iron. The first guard threw down his weapon when he saw the numbers. The second fired wild until a trooper knocked him flat with a shoulder. In the holding space, women cried out and then fell silent when they saw faces that meant rescue rather than trade. Sarah found a hammer and struck the chain lock until the pin gave. Taka met the foreman near the ledger table. The foreman called him heathen and reached for a lantern to hurl, but a shot from the shelf above shattered the handle. Flames licked along, spilled oil, but the cave was stone and the fire ran out of breath. They moved the captives up the stairs 2 at a time. A rider tried to rally at the spur head and went down under a sheet of aimed fire from the squad. The foreman cursed the town and promised return with men who feared no law. Taka answered in a tone that was almost tender. "No more returns," he said. He bound the man's hands and looked towards Sarah as the storm at last broke above them. Rain came as if the sky emptied a long grief. Sarah reached for his forearm, and in that touch a vow formed that needed no witness and no priest to hold it. The night held its breath. The night held its breath. The night held its breath. They brought the rescued women into the post-chapel and the schoolroom beside it. Lanterns threw soft circles across benches and quilts. The storm moved east, but a new danger gathered in its wake. Scouts rode back at dusk with news that the gang had called in help from deserters and river thieves who had lost business to the railroad. They were riding for the post. The commander set barricades at the north and west gates. He placed a Gatling on the parade ground and prayed that the belt would not jam. Sarah checked rifles, filled canteens, and tried to steady her hands. Taka spoke with his people who had followed the sign to the edge of town. Their leader, an older man named Wapaha, agreed to hold the ridge beyond the mill. Night pressed down. The first shots came from the north road, a probing volley that chipped the fort wall and sent splinters skipping. Riders wheeled in the dark and cursed any shadow that moved. Some shouted that the town belonged to them now. One called the defenders cowards and promised that the women would fetch high price once order broke. Sarah stood on the chapel steps with her rifle across both palms. Taka took position by the schoolroom door, where the wind smelled of wet chalk and damp cedar. The air between them was a line that both could feel and neither would break. The fight grew layer by layer. A wagon rolled toward the west gate with barrels piled high. The commander waited, then fired the Gatling in a hard burst that cut the axles and sent the load caving into itself. The barrels were full of sand and scrap iron meant to shield a rush. From the cottonwood lot, a group of rivermen tried to slip through the drainage ditch. Wapaha's line met them with slow, deliberate shots that did not waste powder. Taka moved whenever the defense thinned, and his presence changed fear into decision. Sarah saw him lift a fallen trooper to cover, then sprint to the wall as a ladder went up. A rider tore across the green with a torch, aiming for the chapel roof. Sarah stepped into the open and fired. The torch tumbled away, and the rider pitched from the saddle. That moment cost her. A round slapped the chapel rail and knocked her sideways. She hit the step and lost breath. The world narrowed, then surged back with stubborn light. Taka was suddenly there, a wall of calm. "You are hurt," he said. She shook her head and forced a smile that had more grit than joy. "I am upright." He nodded once and returned to the line, but the look they traded said what the gunfire would never drown. An hour in, the gang tried a feint at the north and a push at the west. The Gatling answered until the belt ran low. The commander sent a runner for more, and the boy vanished in the maze of barracks and smoke. Sarah asked Taka for a plan that did not require a miracle. He said the mill wheel could flood the ditch if the sluice gate were cut. Flood the ditch, and the men in it would lose cover and nerve. It meant a run through a blind yard with rifles waking ghosts. Sarah said she would go with him. He said the gate would take 2 hands, and that her hands were the ones he trusted to hold the wrench steady. They moved low along the carpenter shop and through a garden that had not yet learned to grow in hard posts. Bullets hit dirt like hail. They reached the wheel pit, where water thumped with patient power. Taka dropped into the sluice with a rope around his waist. Sarah braced, feet set, and turned the rusted handle as he forced the wedge. The gate shuddered and then gave with a moan. Water leaped into the ditch, cold and sudden. Shouts rose from the dark as men lost footing and courage. Wapaha's line advanced 2 paces and held. The pressure on the west gate eased. Near midnight, the attackers tried one last charge down the north road. The defenders waited until the riders were close, then fired in a rolling volley that took the will from the charge. The gang pulled away at last, leaving the field terrain and the slow creak of rope on halters. In the echo of the retreat, Sarah leaned against the chapel door and closed her eyes. Taka stood beside her, and the quiet between them felt like the first warm day after a hard winter. "When this is over," she said, "come with me to the high country. You can show me how the light looks when it breaks over stone." He answered without hesitation, "I will." The night held its breath. The night held its breath. The night held its breath. Dawn rose hard and clean. The post smelled of wet rope, spent cartridges, and coffee that had boiled too long. Scouts followed the retreating gang and found their camp broken in haste. The commander signed orders while his hand still shook, then offered thanks in a voice that had learned humility. He asked Wapaha to accept supplies and grazing permission in the valley for a season. He asked Taka to consider a post as a civilian scout. Taka said his place was with his people, but he would ride when justice called. Sarah listened and felt a pride that did not depend on any witness. There were dead to bury and many to comfort. The doctor worked in silence while troopers mended gates and schoolchildren gathered fallen shingles. The doctor's wife sat under guard with a look that insisted she had been wronged by weather, not by will. Papers in her trunk named buyers across the border and officers who had sold routes in exchange for coin. The commander wrote letters that would cut more than one career. The foreman of the caves tried to brag that money would free him. No one answered. Taka visited the chapel where women sat with quilts over their knees and read verses in low voices. He found his sister and took her hand. She told Sarah in halting English that a calm had returned where fear had lived too long. In the days that followed, the town changed its gait. Some men offered apologies without using the word. Some who had shouted slurs kept their eyes down when Taka passed. Sarah began to ride out each evening along the ridge, where grass moved like a river that remembered a kinder age. Taka met her there when he could. They did not speak often about the night, because the night had already said enough. They spoke about water rights, about a small school that might travel with the camps, about herbs that eased fever without making a man dull. He showed her a root that cooled the head, and a bark that slowed a pulse that ran too fast. She smiled and said the land had given him books that no city owned, and summer tilted toward fall. Wapaha led the families north along the trail that edged the hills of Wyoming, where blue distance made every worry look smaller than it felt. Sarah asked her father for leave to travel, and he agreed with a slow nod that accepted what the heart chooses when storms test it. The commander supplied a wagon, seed, tools, and a letter of passage that promised fairness at way stations. Sarah rode the sorrel that hated geese, and Taka rode a bay that loved water shallow enough to splash. At night they camped where stars felt near enough to answer softly when spoken to with respect. On the 3rd week, they came to a valley shaped like an open hand. A spring bubbled near a ring of cottonwood. They set a small camp and built a shelter that faced morning. Men and women from Wapaha's circle raised a frame for a school tent. Sarah unrolled maps and talked through routes between ranches, rail whistle stops, and camps where children changed language without changing hope. Taka worked with tools and quiet jokes that made hard tasks feel light. When the frame stood straight and the canvas pulled true, the circle sang a song that rose like smoke and settled like blessing. One evening, a rider approached with a white cloth tied to a branch. He carried a message that a judge would arrive within a week to try the captured men and to take testimony. The rider warned that a few stragglers from the gang had been seen near the Sweetwater. Taka and Sarah rode out the next morning with 2 scouts to check the passes. In a narrow draw, the stragglers tried a desperate ambush. The first shot nicked a rock by Sarah's knee. She slid from the saddle and found a hollow that kept her safe while she fired in rhythm with the scouts. Taka flanked the shooters and called for them to lay down arms. 2 did. 1 did not, and the answer came quick and final. The draw went quiet again. They returned to the valley as the sun lowered behind granite that looked like old men at rest. Children ran to meet them, and their feet made small drums on the hard ground. Wapaha lifted a hand, and the camp fell into an easy hush. Sarah looked at Taka, and the last long piece of fear inside her at last found a place to set down. "We made it here," she said. "We did more than survive." He took her hand. "We built a morning," he said. Under a sky that promised weather, not war, they spoke a vow that needed no paper. The wind moved through cottonwood leaves with the same voice that had opened the first night at Fort Riley, but the sound now carried a new meaning. It was the voice of a world that could be mended by courage that did not brag, and by love that did not back away when tested. The night held its breath. The night held its breath. The night held its breath.